Great. Hello, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. And I will be talking and letting people in at the same time. And my name is Evie Wolf, and I'm the current president of the JSSS. I want to welcome all of you to this JSS online series. It's a series of free events online, and it's offered by the JSS members. Today, our speaker is Robert Mitchell. And Robert has been member of JSS for many, many years. Maybe you can tell about it when you speak, Robert. And one of the great contributions that come from Robert speaks about Jungian psychology, individuation, and education, which is a very important topic. And sometimes it's also a kind of a topic that might make you feel lonely when you're talking about this topic. Robert has been working as a teacher. You worked as a teacher for close to 30 years in junior and junior high school, teaching math.
Junior high and high school.
Junior high and high school. And teaching art and math and English, so many different subjects. Today, Robert is going to talk about his latest book. It's called Teacher Seeking the Vocational Archetype. Robert will speak for approximately about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. As I said, this talk is recorded. It will be made available on our YouTube channel. The way you find our YouTube channel, you go on YouTube, and then you search for Jungian Society for Scholarly Studies, subscribe to the channel, and you'll get notification whenever we get the videos up. And they already, at least 3, our previous speakers are there. So because Robert is in Mexico and the bandwidth is not very great there, we might need to turn Robert's video off, but we will continue. We'll just sail smoothly through it, even if it's just the audio. I hope it's okay with everybody. If you have any questions while Robert is talking, please type them into chat, and then we'll collect them. And of course, when we get to the questions and answers part, you can just raise your hand and you'll get a chance to ask your question. Without further ado, Robert, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Eva. I appreciate that. Good afternoon or morning or whatever it is, wherever you are. I want to start by saying that in this book, and here's the cover of the book, in this book, there are really 2 threads that I have taken up. One is I would call it a Jungian psychology thread, and I'm gonna let me read something to you here. This is from one of the endorsements from Clifford Mays, whom some of you may know. He says that in my book, it's a particularly adroit deployment of the fullness of Jungian psychology to the wide range of problems besetting our schools today. But it's not an analytical book, and it doesn't talk about it in theoretical terms. The other thread of the book is to talk about the purposes of education. And so in this talk, I'm going to stick with the Jungian concepts because this is a Jungian group. And what I'm going to do, I will tie them together, but I'm going to read some portions, some scenes from the book, about 4 scenes from the book that'll give you an idea of how I developed an idea in Jungian psychology that I call developmental individuation, which is a developmental process among children and young people that can be stimulated perhaps even more in the classroom than it is in the family situation. This book started, I started writing this book after I did my first year of teaching in a small school here in Mexico. I was living in Paris with my wife and my daughter. My wife was Parisian, and we separated. I was in the process of writing a novel at that time, and I decided to come back to Mexico, where we lived before, a small city south of Mexico City. One evening, I was working on the novel here, and I had a writer's block. And then the summer, I was invited to a dinner with some friends, and they told me about a teaching job that would be coming available in the fall. There was a lady in Cuernavaca by the name of Joanne Werner who had started a small school that she called the American High School Tutoring Section, which was connected with the larger American school in Mexico City. And we sat down and talked, interviewed, and she decided to hire me to teach 2 English classes, 2 math classes. My background at that time was a bachelor's in mathematics. 2 English classes, 2 math classes, an art class for all the students, and a class in world history. And it was a class in world history that was most important in helping me to understand and to get some ideas about the 2 major questions that I had about this calling or occupation that I had pretty much stumbled into in this situation. So in my history class, I was teaching, I was doing lectures on the topic of the day and trying to solicit student discussions and so on. And one day during a relatively dull lecture, Matt, a lanky and lethargic 15-year-old who sat in the back of my classroom, spoke up and he said, "Why are we learning this stuff? History is irrelevant." Well, I don't know if you're aware of what's going on in social studies and history programs and government programs, not only in high schools and junior high schools, but also in the university. What Matt said in 1978 has become a reality very much. I mean, a lot of people feel today that history is irrelevant. So anyway, he caught me off guard. So for a long moment, we just stared at each other. And then my own doubts about the course and about and my own vulnerability, and that's defined question, shattered the confidence that I had carefully nurtured through my rapport with my students. And that rapport was a result of being honest with them. So I was reluctant to offer the most obvious and standard answer to the question that we study the past in order to understand the present. I wanted to give them a more complete answer. I managed to say something about wanting to consider the question, and then I was saved from further discomfort by the bell, and a few days later by spring break, though it wasn't much of a break for me, for I had a week to figure out the relevance of history in the lives of my 15-year-old students. They wanted an answer to Matt's defiance, and I had to tell them something or risk losing the class to Matt for the rest of the school year. When we returned from spring break, I again took up my large geometry compass. Some of you may remember that geometry teachers had a large compass so they could make circles on the blackboard or the whiteboard now. I took up my large geometry compass and drew a circle on the board, and then I wrote in the middle of the circle, U. I shaded the area around the outside of the circle, and I wrote the word history. Here we are, I began to tell my students, pointing at the blackboard, each one of us plunked down in the midst of history. But how are we connected to history? That's the important question, isn't it, Matt? That is what makes the study of history relevant. History becomes irrelevant when we detach ourselves from it. That is, when we lose contact with our heritage, what we inherited from our ancestors. We listed some inherited traits on the blackboard, beginning with genetic factors. Then we moved toward the more abstract characteristics of individual heritage, such as ethnicity, religion, and the concept of a cultural heritage. Now let's make up our own theory about history, I said. What we want this theory to show is that there is something inside you that connects you to your cultural heritage. So what's inside you? After a long pause, during which the class was silent, I pointed to my head. A brain, Laura asked, as though she really wasn't quite sure what answer I was looking for. More than that, I said, what does the brain do? Think, she added. Right, but it's more too. I prodded the students until they came up with the concept of thought, the process of thinking, and then we moved toward the more abstract concepts of mind with its various functions of perception, memory, and will. I steered the discussion toward the concept of a conscious self-image, and I used the psychological term ego, emphasizing that ego and mind overlap to form a center of consciousness, a center of self-conscious awareness. Through the ego, we are aware of ourselves in historical time and space. On the blackboard, I drew a small circle just inside the larger one and labeled it mind, under which I wrote your mental image of yourself. What else is there inside you? I asked as I turned back to the class. A spirit, John replied with such self-certainty that there was no room to question him. I whirled around and drew a star in the center of the circle and labeled it spirit. So what does the spirit do? Oh, it keeps you alive, John answered with bravado. Okay, but how is spirit related to mind? After a long silence, I added, didn't we say that we know things with the mind? Does the spirit know anything? Is it conscious? Again, John answered, this time more cautiously. The spirit knows everything, doesn't it? Let us assume that John is right, I said, and the spirit is omniscient, meaning all meaning. I wrote the word on the blackboard and asked one of the students to check my spelling in the dictionary while I continued. We might then say that the spirit knows everything while the mind only knows what it learns. That is, while the mind is only conscious of our place here on earth and in our historical time, the spirit is superconscious. It knows all our ancestors and their historical times, and the spirit knows our place in eternity and in the cosmos. Here's an important question to consider, I said, challenging my students. If the spirit is superconscious and the spirit is inside you, then why don't you know everything? The students stared blankly at me, and I stared back at them. And then Laura spoke up again, this time quite certain of her answer. There's no connection between them, she said. I turned around and drew a small oval between the star that represented the spirit and the circle that represented the mind-ego complex. There is a connection, I offered. The question is what to call it. I believe this is what the ancient Greeks used to call the soul. Matt interrupted. I don't see what all this religious stuff has to do with history. Actually, Matt has brought up an interesting point, I replied. When we study history, we study different cultures. So all cultures are interwoven with religions. So religion has a lot to do with history. I listed some of the interwoven religions and histories that we had been studying throughout the school year on the blackboard: Western civilization and Judeo-Christianity, Arabic culture and Islam, Asian cultures and Hinduism and Buddhism. One thing we learn when we study history is that cultures do not die, I continued. They evolve into new forms, even when their histories come to an end. I reminded the students of the Greeks and Romans, whose cultures lie at the foundation of our own Western civilization, our own Western culture. Also, I went on, each one of us has a personal history of an ancestral heritage that began with our cultural origins and has evolved throughout history. Our spirit already knows that story, but the mind has to learn it. The soul makes a connection between the mind and the spirit, and the more we learn about our cultural heritage, the more we learn about where we come from, and the more we know about ourselves. Some of this knowledge can be gained by studying history. So studying history helps us understand our cultural origins, our cultural heritage, and our cultural identity. That understanding helps us know who we are. Some students cautiously agreed, and then the bell rang. That was all there was to our discussion of the relevance of world history in our lives, though I might have added that nurturing the soul is how we know that what we learn with the mind tells us a truth about ourselves, a truth known only to our deepest inner spirit. I left my drawing on the blackboard for all my students to contemplate and hoped it would help them to make the connection between studying history and discovering the self, an identity formed out of the mysterious relationship between the individual's body, mind, soul, and spirit. Then a few days later, I wrote above my improvised diagram of the holistic personality, know thyself, and to thine own self be true. So that was an introduction to the concept of holistic education, which I hadn't studied at all. My first memory of reading about holistic education was in the mid and late 80s, and this was already 1978. So I was just forming this foundation of a holistic concept, and the fundamental idea, the fundamental objective of the holistic concept was that in education, you need to educate the mind, you teach the mind, but you also need to nurture the soul, nurture the character of the soul in the child, and that character is represented by the archetypes in the child as well as in the teacher, and we'll get to that in a minute. Of course, that was only a brief introduction to the whole concept. And what was going to help me the most was when I came to a situation where I would be able to see that relationship taking place in another teacher. And what happened was that I taught only 1 year in Mexico. I took the place of a teacher who was on maternity leave for a year. So then I had to make a decision about going back to the States. And when I got back to the States, I went back to the Chicago area where I had lived before. And I taught for a year in a private Catholic school, a girls' Catholic school on the south side of Chicago. And at the same time, I started taking the courses that I needed to be certified as a teacher in the public school system. And part of every teacher training program is to spend the semester observing and practice teaching under the guidance of a mentor teacher. And even though I had 2 years of experience teaching in private schools, I too had to complete this certification requirement. At Elmhurst College, student teaching assignments came in late August. So it was not until the day before classes started that I received my assignment to student teach math in a local junior high school. Briefly, I was introduced to a mentor teacher whom I shall call Linda, and I settled into a student desk in the back of the classroom to observe her work. The public educational system was a new experience for me. And observing classes, I had to understand her methodology from the frames of reference of both Joanne Werner School in Cuernavaca and the Academy of Our Lady, where I had been teaching the Catholic school. Linda was a very pretty young woman, about 30 years old. She had a bachelor's degree in mathematics and a master's degree in education. She had been teaching at the school for 6 years. Obviously, she was selected as a mentor teacher because she lived up to the expectations of the administration and the school board in meeting the definition of an ideal teacher. That definition was reflected in her classroom organization, her methodologies, and her techniques. She maintained a notebook of neatly typed lesson plans, but because she was experienced in her job, she rarely had to refer to them. She also had a well-stocked closet full of teaching aids and hands-on manipulatives such as blocks and geometric forms that helped our students visualize mathematical concepts. 2, she was well-versed in educational psychology and proudly discussed Jean Piaget's theories of cognitive development with me. Linda had a clear understanding that her 7th and 8th grade students were on the threshold of what Piaget had labeled abstract conceptualization, and she was confident in her ability to assess their cognitive progress from concrete to abstract thinking using Piaget's model. Furthermore, Linda's classroom was managed and disciplined in a way that reflected the militaristic discipline throughout the school, and that atmosphere could be attributed to the principal, whom I should call Mr. Kuchek. For example, Kuchek had decided that the students wasted too much time socializing. So he reduced the time between classes to 2 minutes. The students moved quickly and quietly through the halls, carrying all of their books for morning classes, and during the lunch break, they switched to the books for their afternoon classes. Thus, no time was wasted at their lockers socializing with other students. Linda took this disciplinary initiative a step further. Though it was not a standard procedure at the school, she required her students to line up single file outside the classroom and to enter the classroom silently and take their seats when the bell rang. The lesson was taught according to Linda's own well-ordered routine familiar to the students, and when the lesson was completed, Linda circulated through the class while each student worked on his or her problem set alone and in silence until the bell rang. I observed the routine for 6 weeks as required, at which time I was considered competent to draw up my own lesson plans and take over the classes under Linda's tutelage. My first class went smoothly enough, but the second class, I just went out into the hallway and told the students to just come on in and sit down. They stared blankly at me, and I just said, come on in and sit down. It's okay. And they chatted among themselves about this change in routine. And while I was taking roll, Linda ducked quietly out of the classroom. A few minutes later, she returned and mumbled something about administrative processes and said that Mr. Kuchek would like to see me. Kuchek was not in a very good mood, and his words were abrupt and spoken in the manner of a military order. I want you to get out of my school right now, and don't you ever come back. I was stunned, but by the time I arrived home, I concluded that my effort to make some kind of human contact with the students had upset the military discipline of Kuchek's junior high school. A week later, I was assigned to Blackhawk Junior High School in a neighboring suburb. I arrived before school started to meet with Mr. May, the principal, and my new mentor teacher, Kathy. By the time our meeting was over, the halls were buzzing with students, and they looked curiously at me, and I greeted them. As I greeted them, they smiled. Kathy showed me the room where we would be teaching 7th grade earth science, and then she led me down the hall to her math classroom. I was to observe her teaching methods for a week before taking over her full schedule of classes. Kathy was about the same age as Linda, though not quite so Barbie doll pretty. The first thing I noticed about her was that she was 5 months pregnant and radiated with that special kind of spiritual beauty evident in so many pregnant women. The students, an animated group of 25 12-year-olds, entered the classroom. Some immediately took their seats, though some of the girls chatted with Kathy and felt her belly to see if the baby was moving yet. I started to take a seat in the back of the classroom, but Kathy stopped me. She introduced me to the class and handed me the seating chart. She said, "You'd better start learning names." We spent our prep period together in the teacher's lounge, where Kathy introduced me to the other teachers and began to go over her own routine of designing lesson plans. Kathy's classes, too, were well-managed and well-disciplined, reflecting one of the criteria considered in making her a mentor teacher. But it was also evident that both classroom management and discipline stemmed from a mutual respect between Kathy and her students, not from strict adherence to impersonal management methodologies and disciplinary techniques. The students were attentive during the lesson and then worked together on their problem sets. Kathy asked me to participate in helping students, and the two of us circulated throughout the classroom. But as she also paired with students who needed help with students who quickly grasped the material, so that the classroom was not silent, but rather hummed with a lively and animated interactive learning experience. By the time I took up my position as a student teacher, I had already learned the names of many of our 130 students, and as my mentor, Kathy, carefully scrutinized my lesson plans before each day's classes, she stressed innovation and told me to make my classes as lively and interesting as possible. When my student teaching was completed, she noted my empathy with the students as the high point of her evaluation of my work. The difference between these two teachers and these two schools is evidence. The one under Kuchek's guidance placed a high priority on management style, militaristic discipline, and the mechanics of learning. Linda's textbook perfect teaching style reflected that approach to education, but her approach had also had the effect of severing the child's thought processes from his or her pre-rational, sentient, and imaginative nature. The result was that the child's intellectual curiosity and imagination were stifled. That psychic energy in the child was redirected toward forming an abstract, rational self-vigilance of his or her performance and behaviors to meet outcome-based expectations. Linda's educational style was consistent with her personality as a detached role-playing professional with a strictly objective approach to learning. One could also conclude that this approach met the implied objectives of the district's concept of child personality development. The school under Mr. May's leadership was a warm and human environment that was sometimes even a little chaotic, just as one might expect of a junior high school with over 400 12 and 13-year-old students. Kathy's approach to teaching made the child the most important subject of the educational experience. In Kathy's classroom, the nurture of the soul and the education of the mind were delicately interwoven. This resulted not from an intellectual effort, but from the fact that for Kathy, teaching was a calling, a vocation that engaged her whole personality, not just a job or a professional role. And one could see in Kathy's personality the spontaneous and unpretentious union of the good mother and the good teacher archetype. These characteristics of the good teacher are tangibly recognizable. And during my years as a classroom teacher, I saw in my colleagues and tried to learn from myself what can best be described as the tools of the trade that help you to educate the mind and nurture the soul at the same time. They are not the things that are taught in teacher training programs, but rather disciplined requirements that one demands of oneself to be a good teacher. And over the course of my career, I discovered that these tools of the trade, far more than subject proficiency or prescribed classroom methodologies, are the vocational objectives that define the vocational archetype of the teacher. So let me just list them briefly. Good teachers are always storytellers, and good teachers are artists, because arts help to bring out those things in the students that they cannot express rationally in intellectual terminology. Good teachers are dramatists. Kathy gave me an assignment one time to teach a class, a completely innovative class, and I studied J.E. Cirlot's book, The Dictionary of Symbols, and did a class on the symbolism of the numbers from 0 to 9 for the 12-year-old students, and they were purely enchanted by it. It was a really good lesson, actually. Good teachers are always scholars of the subjects they teach. Good teachers are philosophers. A philosophical approach requires a good teacher to answer the question of how his or her particular grade or course fits into the child's overall intellectual and personality development, rather than just consider yourself as a cog in the wheel and let the Department of Curriculum decide what developmental objectives fit the classroom. And that's happening a lot nowadays. And good teachers are in some way psychologists, and they study psychology. In fact, in the book, I do a relatively brief chapter where I do a comparison between the Freudian and the Jungian approach to educational psychology, but it's very brief, and it doesn't get into the basic topic that that I'm going to introduce now, and that is developmental individuation, which is a way of associating to young people in a manner that helps you to discover the archetype of the teacher within yourself, because it's a reciprocal process. I've been in the Chicago area for about 4 years, and in 1986, I moved to Santa Cruz, California, where I taught in a small school district up in the mountains, San Lorenzo Valley School District, that covered a number of small towns and villages that went over the hill over to Silicon Valley. So this was an area in the early 1980s, and in the 1980s, mid 1980s, was populated by a lot of hippies, but also a lot of alternative people. And then there were people in the high-tech industry who commuted over the hill to Silicon Valley. So it was kind of a mix of things. And I started out that teaching experience in that particular school district. I was hired to teach a summer school remedial class for students who had failed their freshman algebra class in high school. Jennifer was a pretty blonde California girl, and she was one of 2 girls in the class. The reason she had failed her freshman math course, I discovered, stemmed from a year-long struggle with a difficult home situation. And for reasons of her own, she had resisted discussing the problem with the school's counselors. But Jennifer felt that she could talk to me. She came to me after class one day and just began to talk, and I listened as she unburdened her soul of the problems she was having with her mother, with whom she lived, and her grandmother, who lived next door. What seemed obvious was that Jennifer needed to talk to a man about her problem, and her father was not in the picture. I listened to Jennifer's story and to the anger and the pain and the frustration in her voice. Her story would have provided rich material for a trained clinical psychologist. But I also believe that Jennifer's situation could be described in the classic metaphor of a fairy tale. One of my favorite fairy tales for young adolescent students was Rapunzel. It's a classic tale of a young maiden who was torn away from her real parents to be raised by a witch, the chthonic or devouring dark side of the archetypal mother. Rapunzel was locked in a tower, symbolically the imprisonment of her inner spirit. Of course, a handsome prince rescued her, and the story ultimately had a happy ending. I let go of my ego as I told the story, dramatically adapting the voice of the characters and merging with the archetype so I could reach out to Jennifer at an intuitive, feeling tone, and imaginative level. This form of interrelatedness that is described as participation mystique, a mysterious soul-to-soul level of sentient and imaginative dialogue that transcends the ego. It is a trans-individual relationship. Then, because she was old enough to understand the symbolism, I engaged her in analyzing the story in relation to her own situation, so that together we drew the metaphorical emotions and images up into mental consciousness. This was a fundamental technique of holistic education that draws out the student out of the student's psyche insights and intuitions that then evolve into sentient revelations and relevant images, and then give them conscious meaning. I use this analysis to illustrate how our mother's alcoholism was forcing Jennifer into a codependency situation, the kind of relationship that imprisons the spirit and devours the soul. I believe that by associating with Rapunzel, the archetype of the young maiden, the young princess, and simply becoming conscious of her relationship with her mother in terms of an archetypal pattern, that Jennifer would find the strength in herself to deal with this situation. This strategy followed the pattern of the three-pronged technique that I tried to use in all of my classroom lessons. First, know thyself. Second, find the confidence to follow your own instincts, intuitions, and feelings. In other words, be true to yourself. And third, have the courage to assert your own individuation. All that I could do with Jennifer was to try to help her recognize the archetypal patterns in her life and hope that it would help her find the archetypal essence of the heroic princess in her own personality. Had we begun with an analysis of her situation and then applied the story as an illustration, she would have intellectualized and abstracted the symbolism in her mind without actualizing, without feeling and imagining the archetypal essence in her soul. By first using storytelling as a catalyst to connect with her at the trans-individual level of the soul, I was able in herself and draw it up to the threshold of consciousness. That technique required a participatory, soul-to-soul, mentor-protege connection that was symbolic and deeper than the teacher-student roles of our egos. It was as reciprocal individuation. This episode with Jennifer was the catalyst that helped me to find mentor, Odysseus's advisor, the archetype in my own personality. So that's the essence of it, is this concept of reciprocal individuation. That's how you find the archetype of the teacher in yourself, is by finding the archetype of the teacher in the student. And I'll get into that discussion in just a minute with when I talk about Eric Neumann. But I want you to know that I have this kind of relationship with a whole group of students that in the same little clique that Jennifer was in. And there were a number of them. One of them by the name of Devin. Devin was one student in whom the metaphysical qualities of the soul were visible and with whom I developed a soul-nurturing trans-individual relationship. In Devin, the struggle with ordinary adolescent angst was carried out with extraordinary intensity. And that struggle illustrated the conflict between a personality that was awakening from childhood, still driven by the powerful energy of his sentient, imaginal soul consciousness and the social pressures on the developing ego of a young adolescent. But Devon was an angel. The archetype, the heroic archetype in the soul of Devon was that of an angel. Eric was another young student with whom I was able to develop a reciprocal trans-individual relationship of soul nurturing. And the heroic archetype in Eric's soul was that of the warrior. A third student was named Ian, and in Ian it was the young prince. And then there was a student named Michael who his archetype was that of the trickster. And then there was another one by the name of Paul, whom I discussed, who was taken over by a demonic neo-Nazi spirit. He was a really tough one. But I had archetypal relationships with all of these students, and they stimulated in me this concept of the archetype of the teacher, which came out of me. The mentor archetype came out. Tales of storytelling to help evoke a lot of that. When the tales are embellished with just the right amount of detail, vocal inflection, and gesture, then a child or an adolescent will form his or her own image of what it's like to be a princess, a prince, an angel, or a warrior. And when a child asks to have a story repeated, it is to experience over and over again the imaginative recreation of the archetypes in the soul conscious imagination so that they can become familiar. This example implies that archetypes emerge in the psyches of young people through mutual and reciprocal archetype relationships with adults, with the vocational archetype of the adult, whether it's a parent or a teacher or something else. This is true with both parents and teachers. Philosopher psychologist Erich Neumann explains this archetypal relationship in more precise psychological language. He says, when two human beings are united by a powerful bond, their mutual appetency forms a bilateral connection between them, release each other. So it takes two individuals to affect or set into motion these transpersonal factors of archetypes as they express themselves in the character of the personality. And once we have grasped this interhuman reality and the two-footedness of the archetype, 1 foot in the mother, 1 foot in the child, 1 foot in the teacher, 1 foot in the student. Once we grasp this interhuman reality of the two-footedness of the archetype, it will be clear to us that an archetype cannot be evoked by any spontaneous process within the psyche. That is, the emergence of the archetypes results from a participation mystique, a reciprocal, trans-individual, soul-to-soul relationship between two people. That mystique exists naturally between parents and children and is based on the instinctive, intuitive, sentient, and imaginative ways of knowing that are inherent to the child. Erich Neumann continues. He says that once an archetype has been evoked successfully, the archetype can become an autonomous and function like an independent organ. For the students with whom I had an archetypal relationship at school, I had to assume that they had already experienced a trans-individual relationship with a parent that was in fact strong enough to successfully evoke the archetype, and that the heroic archetype was already functioning autonomously, much as my own teacher archetype was functioning autonomously. But they both needed to be stimulated. They both needed to be nurtured. For example, it was easy to imagine that from the time Jennifer was born, she was Daddy's little princess. Perhaps as she grew older and her father was no longer in the picture, no longer in her life, that princess image became an irritation to her mother. Her mother's alcoholism and her own insecurities were imprisoning Jennifer in a codependency relationship that put a lot of stress on a 15-year-old struggling to become her own person. She needed to know that what had happened to that little princess. When she unburdened her soul to me, I responded to the powerful bond of mutual appetency, releasing the teacher archetype in me and the archetypal heroic princess in Jennifer. After his father and mother separated when he was still quite young, Devon became Mom's little angel. As he grew older, that trope wore off, and eventually Mom found a new boyfriend. At the age of 12, Devon moved to Santa Cruz to live with his father. I met Devon's father several times, and he seemed like a pretty decent guy, but I sensed that his aspirations for Devon were egoic aspirations, very common in this culture, disregarding the deep archetypal influences of that little angel, now transformed into the heroic archetype in the personality of a 14-year-old. But when the teacher archetype in me saw that heroic archetype in Evan, he responded, grasping intuitively the interhuman reality of the two-footedness of the archetype. When Eric's father died, one could imagine that he became Mom's brave little soldier, helping both of them work through the trauma and tragedy that altered their lives. Mom worked through the pain and eventually companion, but the archetypal image of the little soldier, the warrior archetype, lingered in the shadows of Eric's consciousness until the teacher archetype brought it back into the light. Ian was always a prince, the much younger child of older parents who, perhaps already aware of the psychology of archetypes and living in the quasi-mystical environment of the redwood forest, were pursuing their own individuation experience and had already discovered those archetypal qualities of elfin nobility in themselves. And Ian only needed encouragement to differentiate from his parents and retain the archetypal qualities of the prince, the archetypal quality of character behind his personality. So, and it was true that Ian's parents were very much into Jungian psychology as well. I met them in several situations where we studied Jungian psychology in that quasi-mystical environment of the redwood forest of Santa Cruz in 1980. But it's my point is that is this interrelationship between the archetype in the child and the archetype in the adult, which can be called vocational archetype. And the vocational archetype just means the calling of the archetype, and it can be attributed to parents as well as to many different professions.